The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. Across the street from the Grand Atlantic Hotel. A man sits on a piece of cardboard. He has been invisible for 3 years. Tonight, that changes. 300 guests move through crystal light and champagne, and the sound of a string quartet playing something expensive. Black cars arrive one after another. Cameras flash. A woman in a sapphire gown steps onto the entrance carpet, and for one moment, the whole city seems to hold its breath. The man on the cardboard is watching, not her. 2 men in dark suits. Standing in the shadow between the parked cars and the side wall of the building, not watching the entrance, watching the clock. Their hands are still, their eyes are not. He has seen this kind of stillness before, on corners, in doorways. In the particular quiet that comes right before something goes very wrong, he knows what this stillness means. He stands up and he runs. He tore her dress. Right there, in front of 300 people, under crystal chandeliers and flashing cameras, with a string quartet still playing in the background like nothing was wrong. He grabbed the back of that $47, 2000 gown and pulled like his life depended on it. And maybe someone else's did. The sound of ripping fabric cut through the entire ballroom like a knife through silence. One clean, violent sound, then stillness. For exactly 1 second, 300 people stopped breathing at the same time. Then chaos came in all at once. Women screamed. Men shouted. 3 security guards tackled him to the ground so hard his head bounced off the marble floor. His cheekbone hit first, then his shoulder, then someone had his arms wrenched behind his back and the cold stone pressed against his face. Cameras were everywhere. Flash, flash, flash. And in the middle of all that noise and light and confusion, she fell to her knees. Dr. Sandra Anderson, CEO of Beacon Med Technologies, worth $2.1 billion, named by Forbes as one of the most powerful women in American business 3 years in a row, on her knees on a hotel lobby floor, holding the ruined pieces of her dress together with both hands, tears cutting through her makeup while 300 people watched and every phone in the room recorded. And the man who did it? Face down on the cold marble. 3 large men on top of him, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. His name was Darnell Cooper, 32 years old, no home, no address, no next of kin listed anywhere. Just a square of cardboard he'd been sleeping on across the street. By 11 o'clock that night, 8 million people had watched the video. By midnight, the comments told you everything you needed to know about how the world had decided to understand this. Lock him up forever. This is exactly why these events need better security. That poor woman, that poor, beautiful dress. Nobody asked the question that actually mattered. Why did he run toward her instead of away? Attackers run away. They escape, or they dissolve into crowds. They get as far from the scene as their legs will carry them. They don't throw themselves directly into the center of the chaos they created, and then lie still while security piles on top of them. But nobody was thinking about that. Not yet. Because when you see a homeless man and a billionaire, your brain already knows the story. You don't need the details. You don't need to ask questions. You've already decided what happened and why and what it means. That's the thing about being invisible. It's not just that nobody sees you. It's that when they finally do look, they only see what they expected to find. The night had started 4 hours earlier. 4 hours before the dress was torn. 4 hours before the videos. Before the headlines, before the whole world made up its mind. It started with a man sitting on a piece of cardboard. And 2 other men who believed, completely and incorrectly, that nobody was watching them. 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the kind of cold that doesn't just settle on your skin, it gets inside you. Works its way into your joints, into the back of your throat, into that quiet place behind your eyes where you keep the things you'd rather not think about. Darnell Cooper knew this cold better than most people know anything. He'd been sleeping outside in Chicago for 3 years now. 3 full winters. He'd learned to read cold the way other people check weather apps, not just the temperature, but the quality of it, the texture. The intention, this cold tonight, heavy and still with no wind to move it, was the kind that said, Find somewhere protected before midnight, or the night is going to take something from you. He was sitting on his cardboard square at the corner, across from the Grand Atlantic Hotel. Not because he'd chosen this specific spot for any meaningful reason. The hotel's side wall cut the worst of the draft. From this angle he could see the entrance clearly, which meant he could see anyone approaching from the street. After 3 years of living without walls, you stopped thinking about views as something decorative. You thought about sightlines. You thought about who could see you before you could see them. 3 years on the streets of Chicago had taught Darnell things that no classroom ever could, not because the streets were wise, but because the streets were unforgiving, and unforgiving things teach you fast. When your margin for error is 0, when one wrong read of a situation could mean a broken nose or worse, when you have no door to lock and no phone to call, and no one who would come. Anyway, you learn to pay attention to everything. You learn to read the way a person holds their shoulders. You learn the difference between eyes that are scanning and eyes that have already fixed on something. You learn whether a group of men walking toward you is loud because they're celebrating or quiet because they've already decided something and the deciding is done. Darnell noticed all of it, not because he was extraordinary, but because he had no choice. He sat with his back against the wall and watched the Grand Atlantic come alive for the evening. The charity gala had been assembling since 6 o'clock, black sedans and hired cars pulling up in a steady stream, women in gowns that cost more than most people's monthly rent, men in tuxedos cut to fit, like they'd been made specifically for tonight. Photographers lined both sides of the entrance carpet. Security guards in black suits with earpieces stood at measured intervals. Darnell watched, all of it with the same flat attention he gave everything. Not jealousy, not bitterness. Just observation. Just the habit of watching that 3 years of necessity had burned into him. There was a time when watching something like this would have felt different, would have felt like looking through a window at a life he was still moving toward. A future that was still coming. That time was 3 years ago. Before the accident, before everything. He'd been 29 when it happened. Junior year at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Mechanical engineering on a full scholarship. GPA 3.8. Professor Whitfield had pulled him aside twice to tell him that he had a natural instinct for structural design, that he thought in 3 dimensions, when most students were still working in 2. Darnell hadn't known what to do with that information. He'd grown up in a household where you didn't talk much about what you were good at. You just put your head down and worked. His father, Raymond Cooper Ray, to everyone who knew him, ran a small auto repair shop in East Atlanta. 41 years old, hands permanently marked by engine grease, laugh lines deep around his eyes, because he was the kind of man who found something worth smiling at in almost every situation. Ray Cooper operated on 3 principles: honest work, hot food, and being home for dinner. He never explained these principles. He just lived them every day until Darnell absorbed them without realizing it was happening. His mother was the kind of woman who remembered everything. Every birthday in the extended family. Every small thing you mentioned wanting 6 months ago. Every time you came home looking tired without saying why. She noticed. She always noticed. She made apple pie on Sunday afternoons because that's what her own mother had done, and her mother before that. And the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and warm butter every Sunday of Darnell's entire childhood. And then there was Emma. Emma Cooper was 8 years old. She liked drawing giraffes, exclusively giraffes, dozens of them, on notebook paper, and the margins of school worksheets, and the inside covers of library books she wasn't supposed to write in. When Darnell asked her once why always giraffes, she looked at him like the answer was completely obvious. Because they're tall enough to see everything, she said. He'd laughed. He hadn't told her it was a beautiful thought. He wished, every single day since, that he had told her. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November. Rain on I-90 westbound, outside Chicago, coming back from visiting their grandmother in Joliet. The truck driver had been on the road for 19 hours. 19 hours is past the legal limit. past any limit that makes human sense. His name appeared in the police report, and Darnell had read that report so many times in the weeks afterward that he had every line of it memorized. Not because he wanted to, because he couldn't make himself stop. The truck drifted across 2 lanes. Impact on the driver's side, Ray Cooper died at the scene. Gloria Cooper died in the ambulance. Emma Cooper died at Rush University Medical Center at 7:42 in the evening, and Darnell had been in a separate vehicle following behind, and he had watched it happen in front of him, and he had not been able to do anything except watch. The doctors said he had no serious physical injuries. Cracked ribs, a concussion, nothing that wouldn't heal. They were wrong about that. PTSD doesn't introduce itself. It doesn't arrive with a name and a list of what it needs. It moves in quietly while you're still trying to understand what happened to you. Changes the furniture. Makes the rooms feel wrong in ways you can't quite articulate. Darnell went back to Howard in January and sat in Professor Whitfield's class and stared at equations he could see, but couldn't reach. Like reading words in a language you used to speak fluently and now can't quite access. He stopped going to class in February, stopped answering his phone in March, lost the scholarship in April, lost the apartment in June. His friends tried to help longer than he ever gave them credit for, but grief that size doesn't leave room for other people. It fills every available space. And eventually, people stopped trying to fit. By the following fall, Darnell Cooper was sleeping on a park bench in Grant Park. He'd gotten on a bus without thinking about where it was going. Chicago was where it stopped. He'd been here 3 years now. 3 years of cardboard squares and soup kitchen lines, and being looked through by a city of nearly 3 million people. But somewhere in those 3 years quietly, without him marking the moment it happened, he'd developed something he'd never had before, the ability to see everything. The way you see everything when you genuinely cannot afford to miss anything. He noticed patterns. He noticed behavior. He noticed the specific difference between someone having a difficult day and someone who was moving through a space with a purpose they weren't advertising. He noticed the difference between a crowd that was flowing and a crowd that was about to stop moving all at once. He noticed the 2 men at 7:53 p.m. They were standing near the hotel's valet parking station, not in the main arrival line, but off to the side, in the gap between a row of parked cars and the building's exterior wall. Close enough to see the entrance from every angle. Far enough from the main lighting that they didn't catch attention. Most people arriving at a charity gala weren't watching the edges. They were thinking about getting inside, getting warm, finding their table, finding a drink. Darnell watched the edges. He always watched the edges. The 2 men were well dressed. Dark suits, white shirts, no ties. Late 30s to early 40s. Both of them holding the particular stillness of men who were waiting for something, rather than men who had arrived somewhere. There's a real difference between those 2 things, they see. When you're waiting for a party to start, you look at the door, you check your phone, you make eye contact with other arrivals. You have the small, unfocused restlessness of someone killing time. These men weren't doing any of that. They were watching the arrival lane with the focused attention of liston of men tracking something specific, and every 90 seconds or so, one of them would check his watch. Not his phone, his watch. Darnell had been reading people for 3 years from this kind of distance. That combination, the stillness, the fixed watching, the watch instead of the phone, that was the combination of men with a schedule. Men who needed something to happen at a particular time and were measuring the distance to that moment. Something in his chest had started moving differently, not panic. Something quieter and more specific than panic. The old warning system doing what it was built for. Pay attention to this. He paid attention. The car that brought Sandra Anderson to the Grand Atlantic was a black Lincoln Navigator. And she'd spent most of the 40-minute drive reviewing quarterly reports on her tablet without looking up once. When the door opened at the entrance and she stepped out, the cameras didn't know any of that. They just saw her step out. And that was enough. Sandra Anderson at 35 was the kind of beautiful that doesn't come from effort. It comes from confidence, so settled it has become part of the posture, part of the specific way a person moves through a room. She was 5 feet 10 inches naturally, and tonight she was wearing heels, and she moved the way tall women move, when they've stopped apologizing for taking up space. Her hair was cut close and natural, shaped carefully, worn without the self-consciousness that sometimes accompanied that choice in certain rooms. Sandra had worked past that particular self-consciousness about 5 years ago. The process had taken real effort. She was genuinely proud of it. The dress was what everyone would talk about tomorrow. Deep sapphire blue, shifting toward black in certain angles of light, with over 3,000 crystal beads sewn individually by hand over 6 months of meticulous work. A Connecticut seamstress named Dottie Reeves, 63 years old, had been doing this kind of work for 4 decades. When she delivered the gown 6 weeks earlier, she'd told Sandra it was the finest thing she had ever made. Sandra had believed her, one of a kind. 6 months of labor, $47,000, and Sandra hadn't bought it to make an impression on anyone. She'd bought it because tonight was the annual fundraiser for the Chicago Children's Hospital Network. And 2 years ago, that network had saved the life of her nephew, little James, 4 years old. Sudden cardiac event, 48 hours in the ICU at Lurie Children's before the crisis passed. He was 6 now. He liked dinosaurs and peanut butter sandwiches with the crusts removed, and had recently developed a strong opinion about which color of crayon was objectively the best, a debate he was willing to have at length with any adult who made the mistake of asking. Sandra had written a check for $200,000 to the Children's Hospital Network the week James came home. She'd worn the most extraordinary dress she could find to every gala since, because she believed in showing up fully, in giving something your complete presence when it deserved that, in not hedging when the thing in front of you was worth everything you had. The cameras caught her at the top of the entrance steps. Flash, flash, flash. She smiled and waved and said a few words to the event coordinator. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that 14 days earlier, she had done something that made a very specific category of person very, very angry. Sandra's company, Beacon Med Technologies, had spent 2 years quietly building something that the company's forensic auditing software had uncovered by accident. Nexacorp Industries was one of the largest private health insurance administrators in Illinois. On paper, they managed billing and reimbursement for 11 hospital networks across the state. In practice, they had been systematically overbilling those hospitals, falsifying reimbursement claims, and keeping the difference. The total, over 4 years, $67 million. The money had to come from somewhere. It came from hospital operating budgets, which meant staffing, which meant patient care. Specifically, community hospitals on the south side and west side of Chicago. The ones that served the people with the fewest other options. Sandra had taken her findings to the FBI 18 months ago. She'd cooperated fully. She'd testified before a federal grand jury. And 2 weeks ago, that cooperation had resulted in a formal indictment. Nexacorp's CEO, Scott Hill, 61 years old, Yale Law, a man who had not lost a significant fight in his professional life, was now facing federal fraud charges. His trial was scheduled in 3 weeks. Sandra was the primary witness. She was the one whose software had found the fraud, documented it, verified it, and handed it to investigators. Without Sandra Anderson's testimony, the government's case became substantially harder to win. Scott Hill understood this clearly. The men he'd arranged to deal with the problem understood it too. Sandra Anderson, walking into the Grand Atlantic Hotel at 8:14 p.m., was thinking about the keynote address she was delivering after dinner, and then whether she'd had time to eat anything since breakfast. She was not thinking about 2 men in dark suits, standing 40 feet away in the shadow between the parked cars. But Darnell Cooper had shifted position along the wall for a better angle, and now he could hear them. Not loudly, they weren't speaking loudly, but 3 years of outdoor living had sharpened Darnell's hearing in the specific way that necessity sharpens everything he'd learned to extract quiet voices from ambient noise, because quiet voices were often the ones that mattered. She's at the entrance in about 8 minutes. The first man's voice was completely flat, like someone reading items from a list. Blue dress. Hard to miss. The second man, quieter. Every camera in the place will be pointed at her. When the crowd bunches at the door, that's our moment. Fast and clean. A pause. Sandra Anderson won't see it coming. Darnell felt cold move through him that had nothing to do with the November air. He knew that name. The hotel lobby had a television near the elevator bank. And sometimes when the weather was particularly brutal, a security guard would let him stand just inside the door to warm up for a few minutes. He'd caught pieces of the news coverage over the past weeks. Sandra Anderson, Beacon Med, the Nexacorp indictment. But more than the name, he understood what he'd just heard. You don't spend 3 years listening to the edges of conversations without learning to recognize when words are being chosen carefully, when the casualness of a voice is itself a kind of discipline, when professional calm is the most frightening thing in a situation, fast and clean. That was not two friends making plans. He watched the man on the left shift his weight slightly and reach into his jacket with one hand not deep. Just a brief adjustment, the motion of someone checking that something is where they put it. The movement was too short and too careful to be a phone. Darnell had lived outside in this city long enough to know exactly what that motion meant. He stood up. The first security guard stood at the far left edge of the entrance carpet. Big man. 6'2" at least. Black suit, earpiece, hands folded in front of him in the patient stance of someone who had done this many times. Darnell walked toward him as directly as he could, keeping his voice steady and his hands visible. Hey, I need you to give me 30 seconds. There are 2 men by the valet station, dark suits. Standing off to the left of the main entrance, they've been watching the arrival lane, and I just heard them talking about Dr. Anderson. About timing. About moving. When the crowd bunches at the door, the guard looked at him. 1 second of assessment, 2 seconds, and then Darnell watched it happen. The thing he'd seen happen 100 times in 3 years. That specific recalibration, the moment when someone processes what they're actually looking at. The worn coat, the cardboard dust still on the knees of his jeans, the 3-day stubble, the shoes with the sole beginning to separate at the toe. And before any of the words could land, before the information could even be considered, the conclusion had already been reached. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the entrance area. I'm not trying to get into the party. I'm telling you there are 2 men. Step back. Right now, just look where I'm pointing. 2 men, left of the valet station. The guard moved. Not toward the valet station, toward Darnell. 1 hand on his shoulder, firm, turning him around. If you come any closer to this entrance, I'm calling Chicago PD. We clear? Darnell looked over the man's shoulder. Sandra Anderson was at the top of the entrance steps, cameras flashing around her. She was smiling at someone, completely at ease, completely unaware. He pulled away from the guard's grip and moved 10 feet to the right, toward the second guard, younger, maybe 25, with the attentive posture of someone still proving himself at this job. Please, he knew exactly how he sounded. He knew precisely what this looked like. He kept going anyway, because what was the alternative? 2 men, dark suits. Left side of the valet station. They are not guests. They've been out here for over an hour and they're watching her specifically. The second guard already had his hand up. Hey, stop, don't. He grabbed both of Darnell's arms. The first guard was moving back from the other direction. I've got him. What do you want to do? Darnell stopped moving. Struggling would end this faster and worse. He kept his voice as controlled as he could manage. Just look at where I'm telling you. 30 seconds. If I'm wrong, call the police yourself and I won't say a word. But the first guard wasn't looking at the valet station. He was looking at Darnell. Last chance. Leave the area or we handle this the other way. Darnell looked past both of them. Sandra Anderson was 3 steps from the entrance doors. The crowd was tightening at the door exactly the way it always did when too many people tried to enter through a space that was slightly too narrow, pressing together, creating the natural confusion of bodies that made it hard to see specific things happening at close range. The two men had begun moving, not quickly. They didn't need to move quickly. The crowd was doing the work for them, providing cover, creating the situation they'd described and planned for. Their hands were moving toward their jacket pockets with the deliberate economy of men who had done something like this before. 30 seconds. Maybe less now. The first guard grabbed both of Darnell's shoulders and shoved hard enough that he stumbled and went down on one knee on the pavement. The impact sent pain shooting up through his leg and into his hip. Don't make us do this the hard way. Darnell stayed on his knee for a moment. He looked at the two guards. They had turned back toward the entrance, professionally scanning, seeing everything they expected to see and nothing they needed to see. He looked at Jeffrey Lewis, at the hand coming out of the jacket, at the angle of movement, at Sandra Anderson still 3 steps from the door with people on both sides of her and cameras everywhere and no one looking at the right thing. 300 people in that entrance and not one of them seeing what he was seeing. Not one of them about to do anything. There was a moment very still, very separate from the noise around him, the way certain moments are where Darnell understood with complete clarity what was about to happen and what it would cost him to stop it. He held that understanding for 2 full seconds, then he stood up and ran. The crowd didn't part for him. He moved through it anyway. There was a man with nothing left to protect running at people with no intention of stopping, and eventually bodies moved. He heard shouting behind him, heard someone to his left scream, heard the guard to his left yelling his direction. None of it registered as information that changed anything. He was watching Jeffrey Lewis, watching the hand clearing the jacket pocket, watching the trajectory towards Sandra Anderson, who was right there, still completely unaware, still 3 steps from the door. And then Darnell Cooper did the only thing he could think of. He reached her, grabbed the back of her dress with both hands, and pulled with everything he had. The sound was wrong. That's what people said afterward, in their videos and their posts, and their voicemails, to friends who hadn't been there. They said the sound was wrong. Not like fabric tearing, like something being broken that wasn't meant to be broken. One sharp, irreversible sound that cut through the string quartet and the crowd noise and the string quartet and the camera shutters, and made everyone in a 50-foot radius stop what they were doing. 3,000 hand-sewn crystal beads scattered across the marble entrance floor, like thrown light. They were still skittering and spinning across the stone when the first security guard reached Darnell, and the second arrived a half-second behind him, and the third materialized from somewhere inside the entrance. 3 large men in combination. His feet left the ground. The marble floor came up very fast. His cheekbone hit first, then his shoulder, and then someone had both his arms twisted behind his back at an angle that wasn't natural. And someone else's knee was in the center of his back, and his mouth tasted like copper, and the cold of the floor pressed against his face. The pain was immediate and complete, and he filed it away. He pressed his cheek against the marble and looked sideways through the forest of legs around him. He found Jeffrey Lewis, found Gary Young beside him. Both of them had stopped moving. They were standing maybe 20 feet back in the space that the scattered crowd had opened up, completely still, looking at each other. Jeffrey's right hand was empty. Whatever the next 6 seconds were supposed to look like, whatever fast and clean had meant in practice, it wasn't happening. Every camera in the entrance was pointed at the man on the floor. Every piece of attention in the space had shifted from Sandra Anderson to the scene on the marble. The plan was over. Jeffrey Lewis looked at Gary Young. Gary Young looked back. A full conversation happened without a single word. Then they turned and they walked. Not running, draws attention, and these were professional men who understood that. Just walking. Steady and purposeful, moving at the pace of people who had somewhere to be, and the crowd was still too absorbed in what was happening on the floor to track 2 well-dressed men moving quietly toward the side exit. Darnell watched them until someone's knee shifted his weight and he lost the angle. "Don't move," the voice close to his ear. Low and certain, he didn't move. He could hear Sandra Anderson crying. Not loudly, the kind of crying that happens in the first moments after shock, before the full weight of something arrives, quiet and disbelieving. Why? Her voice was unsteady in a way he suspected it rarely was. "Why would you do this to me?" Darnell thought about answering, thought about the words, about where they actually lived right now, in a body pinned to marble with blood in his mouth, and 3 men holding him down, and how far they would have to travel to reach somewhere they could be heard and understood and believed. He thought about all of it, and then he closed his mouth. Because he already knew. He knew what the footage showed. He knew what the headline was going to be. He knew what happened to homeless men who grabbed billionaires at charity galas, especially when they had reasons. The kind of reasons that nobody was going to ask about. He said nothing. He stayed still. He listened to Sandra Anderson cry, and the security guards bark into their radios, and the growing sound of chaos spreading through the crowd, the way water moves through cloth, finding every available space. Somewhere in his chest, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time had shifted slightly. Not relief. Not anything as clean as that. Just the specific stillness of a man who has done the only thing that was left to do, and is now waiting to find out what that costs. The police arrived in 11 minutes. By then, the first video had 40,000 views. By the time the handcuffs went on, real handcuffs, heavier than they look, the number was climbing toward 1 million. They walked him out through the service corridor, past the catering staff and the coat check and the long hallway that smelled like good food he hadn't eaten, out through the side entrance into the November air and into the back of a patrol car. The holding cell at the 18th district was gray and fluorescent and smelled like disinfectant that hadn't quite done its job. 4 men in it. Darnell took the far bench and sat with his back straight and watched the clock on the wall. He didn't ask for a phone call. He didn't ask for water. He didn't ask for anything. He sat and thought about Jeffrey Lewis walking away through a crowd that wasn't watching him. About the hand that had been coming out of the jacket, about what 6 more seconds would have looked like. He thought about Emma, about how she used to say that giraffes were her favorite animal because they were tall enough to see everything. "I saw it, Em," he thought. "I saw it. Outside the holding cell, through the wall, he could make out 2 officers talking, whole things on video. Multiple angles, open and shut then. Guy hasn't said a word since they brought him in. Homeless. Probably off his medication. DA's going to have a field day." Darnell closed his eyes. He knew what was coming. He understood, with the particular clarity that arrives when you have nothing left to lose, that there was nothing he could say tonight that would change the shape of this. The story had already been written by 14 seconds of footage that showed exactly what it appeared to show. So he sat in the quiet of the holding cell while the city outside decided who he was and what he'd done. While 8 million people watched a video and understood everything. While a woman named Sandra Anderson sat in her penthouse 23 floors above Lake Michigan and stared at the ruins of a $47,000 dress. And somewhere across the city, though, Darnell had no way of knowing this. No reason to imagine it, a detective named Monica Reed was sitting in her office. Watching the same video everyone else was watching, but looking at a completely different part of the frame. The first question nobody asked that night. If Darnell Cooper had attacked Sandra Anderson, why did he run toward her instead of away? The second question nobody asked. Where did the 2 men in the dark suits go? The answers were both already there. In the video, in the background. In the part of the frame that nobody had thought to look at yet. Someone was coming who would look. But not tonight. Tonight, the world had already made up its mind. The dress was in a paper bag in the corner of the room. Sandra hadn't touched it since the paramedic wrapped a hotel blanket around her shoulders and someone she genuinely couldn't remember who had guided her into the elevator and up to the suite the hotel manager had quietly arranged. She hadn't asked for the sweet. She hadn't asked for anything. She'd just let people move her from one place to another, the way you let yourself be moved when you're still trying to understand what happened to you. Now she was in her own penthouse. 23rd floor. Lake Michigan was out there somewhere past the floor-to-ceiling windows, invisible in the November dark. She could only see her own reflection, a woman in a hotel bathrobe on a white leather couch, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold 40 minutes ago, staring at her phone lying face down on the coffee table. She knew what was on it. Thomas Jackson. Her attorney had called 4 times. Victor Bryant. Her interim COO had sent 9 texts in the first 90 minutes. Her publicist, her board liaison, her mother twice. 3 journalists she'd given her personal number to years ago, who apparently believed that entitled them to call at midnight after something like this. She knew what all of them wanted. A statement. A position. A decision about how to proceed. She had none of those things. What she had was a memory that wouldn't stay still. She kept returning to the same moment. Not the moment the dress was torn, not the sound of it, not the feeling of the fabric giving way, not the cold air on her back, or the humiliation of her knees on a hotel floor, with cameras pointed at her from every direction. Not any of that. She kept returning to the 3 seconds before. She'd been moving toward the entrance doors. The crowd was pressing in the way. Crowds do. When an entrance is slightly too narrow for the number of people trying to use it at once. Someone to her left was saying something about the keynote. Someone to her right was asking about seating arrangements. Standard arrival noise. And in her peripheral vision, not directly in front of her, not close enough to register as a threat, just present in the edge of her awareness, there had been 2 men moving toward her with a specific kind of purpose that was different from how guests moved. Not the purposeful movement of someone trying to reach the bar or locate their table. Something more direct, more focused. The way people move when they have already decided where they're going and why. Their hands, she kept returning to their hands. She'd been in the process of turning her head to look at them directly when Darnell Cooper had come through the crowd and everything had broken apart into noise and confusion, and she had stopped thinking about the 2 men completely. Until now, alone in her penthouse at midnight, she couldn't stop thinking about them. Because when she'd looked up from the floor, still in shock, still trying to process what had just happened to her, she'd scanned the crowd the way you scan instinctively when something goes wrong. Looking for context. Looking for the thing that explains the other thing. The 2 men were gone. That crowd had packed in tight the moment Darnell was tackled. People pressing forward to see, pulling back in alarm, some frozen completely where they stood. But not those 2 men. They had been moving toward her with clear intention 30 seconds earlier, and now they simply were not there. Something about that specific absence. Something about the combination of how they'd been moving and how completely they'd disappeared was sitting in her chest. Like a weight she couldn't identify or put down. She picked up her phone, turned it over, ignored the notifications and opened her email, found the video her assistant had forwarded with the subject line, "You need to see this before it gets worse." She didn't watch what everyone else was watching. She moved the playback slider back 15 seconds from the moment the dress tore, and she watched the background. She watched it 4 times. Then a 5th. If on the 5th viewing she paused the frame, their upper left corner of the frame, where the crowd was thickest near the side of the entrance. 2 men in dark suits moving through the crowd with the deliberate, fixed trajectory of people who know exactly where they're going. Their path aimed directly at where she had been standing. The angles of their arms subtly wrong for men who were just walking. Then Darnell Cooper entered the frame from the right side, and the 2 men stopped, completely and immediately stopped. And then without urgency, without any visible reaction to the chaos beginning around them, they turned and walked in the opposite direction, not hurrying. The measured pace of men who had made a decision and were executing it calmly. Sandra sat with the video paused on that frame for a long time. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does at midnight in November, being enormous and cold and completely indifferent to any particular thing happening within it. She thought about Darnell Cooper in a cell somewhere in this city. She thought about his face when they had him on the floor. She'd been looking at him through tears and shock and humiliation, and she'd expected to find something specific in his expression. Aggression. Instability. The visible evidence of whatever had made him do this. What she'd found instead was exhaustion, not violence, not instability. Just a man who was very, very tired. And something behind his eyes, something she couldn't name precisely then or now, that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of a person who has put down something they'd been carrying for too long. She set the phone down, picked it back up, pulled up Thomas Jackson's contact, then stopped. Thomas would tell her to press charges. Thomas would talk about liability and precedent and narrative control and the importance of protecting her position. Those were legitimate considerations. She understood them. But they weren't what she was sitting with right now. Right now, she was sitting with a paused video and a weight in her chest and two questions she couldn't answer. What were those two men doing? And where did they go? She put the phone face down again, pulled the blanket tighter around her, and made one decision before anything else. She would not give Thomas Jackson or Victor Bryant or anyone else a statement until she had the answer to those two questions. She didn't know yet that someone else was already working on exactly that. Someone who had been watching the same video all night and had noticed the same two men and was now doing something about it. Sandra Anderson turned off the lights and sat in the dark with Lake Michigan invisible somewhere beyond her windows. She didn't sleep. Monica Reed's office was small enough that she could touch both side walls if she spread her arms, which she had done exactly once on her first day, to understand the space she was working in. She'd been in this office for 6 years. The walls held caseboards, photographs, a city map with colored pins tracking active investigations, and one framed photograph on the shelf behind her desk. The photograph was of a man named Andre Williams, 54 years old when it was taken. Electrician. Father of 3 daughters. He'd been Monica's witness in a federal extortion case 18 months ago, a careful, soft-spoken man who'd agreed to testify, despite understanding what that meant for him personally. He'd been in protective custody. He'd been 72 hours from the witness stand, and then there'd been an accident on the Eisenhower Expressway that the reconstruction team officially called consistent with driver error. Monica had called it something else. She'd never been able to prove what she called it. The case had closed. The men Andre Williams would have testified against had walked. And Monica had put his photograph on her shelf because she needed to remember, every single working day, that her job was not to follow the obvious story. The obvious story was the one that let dangerous men go home. Her job was to find the true one. She was watching the Darnell Cooper video for the 11th time. Not the main action. Not Darnell running. Not the dress. She had 3 screens running simultaneously, the most shared video, taken from the front left of the entrance, a wider angle video, posted by a woman named Jasmine who'd been standing further back in the crowd, and a third video that had taken Monica 2 hours of searching through social media to find. The third one had been posted by a member of the catering staff, who'd been on a smoke break on the side steps of the hotel. The angle was elevated, slightly looking down at the crowd rather than across it. 97 views when Monica found it. She'd been watching it on a loop since 11:04 p.m. frame by frame. She tracked 2 figures in the upper portion of the frame, darks, suits, moving through the crowd with the specific, purposeful intention of men who have a destination and a timeline. Their trajectory aimed at a fixed point. Then Darnell Cooper entered the frame from the right edge, and the 2 figures stopped. Monica paused it there. 20 years as a detective, 18 of them in organized crime. She had built, across those years, a specific and hard-won fluency in the body language of people who were planning something. The way premeditated action looked different from reactive action. The way men moving toward a target moved differently from men moving through a crowd toward a bar. The particular quality of professional stillness, the kind that isn't relaxation but its opposite, compressed readiness versus the ordinary stillness of people enjoying an event. What she was looking at in the upper left corner of this catering staff video was not people enjoying an event. She picked up her phone and called Brian Thompson. He answered on the third ring with the careful voice of a man who had been asleep and didn't want to admit it. "I need you in here," Monica said. "It's midnight, Monica. I'm aware of the time." A pause. She could hear him deciding. "Is this the Cooper case? Come look at something." He was there in 22 minutes, a crease still visible on his left cheek from the pillow. Brian Thompson was 38 years old and 6 years younger than Monica, and built for the methodical end of detective work, the kind that required following a thread all the way to its end, without losing patience or making assumptions along the way. They'd been partners for 4 years and worked well together. Precisely because they approached the same problems from different directions, Monica found the threads. Brian followed them without letting go. He sat down beside her and looked at the 3 screens without speaking. "Walk me through it," he said. She did, the 2 figures in the elevated camera, their trajectory, the moment they stopped, and then she showed him the detail she hadn't mentioned on the phone. "Timestamp," she said. They left the event at 8:47 p.m. Brian leaned forward. 1 minute and 23 seconds after Cooper was tackled, Brian was quiet. Monica gave him the moment, because she'd already had it and she knew what it felt like to land there. When something violent and unexpected erupts in a crowd, when a man tackles someone and 300 guests erupt into chaos, people don't leave. They stay. They film. They press closer to see. They become part of the story. They'll tell for the next year. The only category of person who exits immediately after that kind of chaos is the person who has a specific reason to leave before someone starts asking questions. "Run there." "Faces," Brian said. "Already cued. I was waiting for you." She pulled up the sharpest frame she'd isolated from the elevated camera. 2 faces. Not perfect resolution, but workable. She ran them through the department system. 4 minutes. The results came back, and Monica looked at the first one, then the second, and sat back in her chair. "Brian, I see it. Jeffrey Lewis. 38 years old. 3 arrests, aggravated assault in 2018, assault with a deadly weapon in 2020, extortion in 2022. 0 convictions across all 3 cases. In each instance, the primary witness had become unavailable before trial. 1 recanted, 1 relocated without forwarding information, 1 developed a sudden and severe memory problem. Known associates included 2 men currently under separate federal investigation for witness tampering. Prior employment on file, security consulting. Client listed from 2021, Nexacorp Industries, Gary Young, 41 years old. 2 prior arrests, extortion in 2019, witness intimidation in 2021. 1 conviction, 14 months served, released early. Known associates overlapping substantially with Lewis. Monica pulled up the financial records, accessible through a warrant she held on a parallel Nexacorp-adjacent investigation that had been running for 3 months. She found it in 11 minutes. Wire transfer October 14th, $12,400. Origin, Meridian Protective Services LLC, registered in Delaware. The managing member listed on the registration was a name that turned out to be a single layer of paperwork over a financial trail that led, carefully but traceable to anyone who followed it far enough, back to a Nexacorp subsidiary operating account. Recipient, Jeffrey Lewis. 14 days before the gala, Monica looked at Brian. Brian looked at Monica. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They weren't guests, Brian said. No, they were there for Anderson. Yes, and Cooper saw them. Tried to warn security twice. Wasn't listened to either time. Monica turned back to the screen, and then did the only thing he could think of to break up what they were about to do. Brian was quiet for a moment, processing. That's a substantial thing to believe about a homeless man at a charity gala who destroyed a billionaire's dress. I know what it is, Monica said. She was already standing, reaching for her jacket on the back of the chair. I'm going to talk to Darnell Cooper. It's midnight. I know what time it is, Brian. He looked at her for a beat. Then he stood and got his own jacket from the hook by the door. The holding cell had 4 men in it. 3 of them were working on sleeping, achieving it to varying degrees. The 4th was sitting on the far bench with his back straight and his eyes open and his hands resting in his lap, looking at the middle distance with the stillness of a man who had learned to wait without it costing him anything. Monica looked at him through the bars. His right cheekbone had a bruise forming, deep against the brown of his skin, lower lip slightly swollen. His eyes, once you got past everything else about him, past the worn-down quality of 3 years lived without shelter, were clear, alert in a way that didn't fit the story she'd been hearing all night. Darnell Cooper, she said. I'm Detective Monica Reed. This is Detective Brian Thompson. We'd like to talk to you. He looked at her, said nothing. We're not here to add charges, she said. We're here because we think something important is missing from what happened tonight. And we think you might be the person who can tell us what it is. Still nothing. Interview room, she said. More comfortable. I can get you water, food if you want it. He held her eyes for a long moment, then he stood. The interview room was small and fluorescent and cold in the way that institutional spaces are always slightly too cold. Darnell sat across the table with his hands unrestrained in front of him. Monica had been specific about that and looked at the 2 photographs she set between them. Jeffrey Lewis. Gary Young, do you recognize these men? He looked down at the photographs. She watched his hands. The small, involuntary tremor that moved through them when his eyes found the faces. Those are the ones I heard. His voice was quiet from hours of silence and a mouth that had taken damage, but the words were deliberate and clear. The ones you heard talking about Dr. Anderson? Yes. Tell me exactly what you heard. Start from when you first noticed them. He looked at her the way she'd seen witnesses look before deciding whether to trust the specific calculation of someone who has been burned before and is trying to determine whether this is another version of the same thing. I'll listen, she said. As long as it takes. Something in his face changed. Very small. But there, and then Darnell Cooper told his story for the first time. He talked for 41 minutes without stopping, and Monica didn't interrupt him. Once. He told them about the cardboard square and the cold and the specific quality of the 2 men's stillness that had first made him pay attention. He told them about the conversation, the exact words he'd heard, the flat, professional tone of Jeffrey Lewis's voice. The phrase fast and clean and the way it sounded like something that had been said before in other situations. He told them about going to the first security guard and being turned away. About going to the second and being shoved to the ground. About the calculation he'd made in the last 30 seconds, not heroic, not dramatic, just the only option, left and then running. He laid the sequence out with a specificity and internal consistency that Monica had learned across 20 years to recognize. People constructing a story added detail in uneven ways too much in the places they'd rehearsed, too thin in the places they hadn't thought about. People remembering a thing they'd lived had a different texture entirely. Every piece connected to the next without seams. Why didn't you tell the police this when they brought you in? Brian asked. Darnell looked at him steadily. Would you have believed me? Brian didn't answer quickly. Which was the honest answer. Think about what I looked like, Darnell said. Think about what 14 seconds of video showed. Think about who I am on paper right now. He paused. 1 sentence into that explanation and the conversation moves to which medication I'd stopped taking. You could have tried, Brian said. I did try. His voice stayed level. Twice. Before it happened, neither time worked. What changes after the dress is torn and she's on the floor? The room held that for a moment. Monica was looking at the photographs of Jeffrey Lewis and Gary Young. The men you've described, she said. Their names are Jeffrey Lewis and Gary Young. Criminal records, both of them. Connected to witness intimidation cases before. And there's a financial record money from an account linked to Nexacorp transferred into Lewis's account 14 days before the gala. She watched him process this, so they were really going to hurt her, he said, not a question. The tone of someone who already knew and needed the confirmation to be external and real. We believe so, he nodded once. Looked down at his hands. I destroyed her dress, he said quietly. In front of 300 people and every camera in the city, a pause. Some hero, Monica looked at him directly. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't come with a clean story attached. Something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Something very small that she almost missed. Is there anything else? She asked. Anything from the conversation or from watching them move that you haven't told us yet? He thought for a moment. The phrase fast and clean the way he said it. It didn't sound new. It sounded like something they'd said before. Like a shorthand they'd used enough times that it didn't need explanation between them. He paused. And he said she won't see it coming right after he said her name. Not they, specifically she. They knew exactly who they were there for. Monica wrote it down. That's useful, she said. Is it enough? She met his eyes. I don't know yet. But it's more than we had an hour ago. They left Darnell Cooper in the holding cell at 2:07 a.m. Standing in the corridor, Monica looked at Brian. He's telling the truth, she said. I know. Every piece of it, I know. Brian rubbed the back of his neck. The problem is how we prove it before Lewis and Young figure out their faces are on camera and disappear. Which means we start tonight. Monica was already moving. Financial trail. Hotel security footage. Every camera between the Grand Atlantic and wherever Lewis and Young parked before the event, she pushed through the door to the parking lot. The cold came in immediately. And we need Sandra Anderson. Brian caught the door behind her. She's going to be surrounded by lawyers by morning. She's surrounded by them right now. Monica unlocked the car. But she doesn't strike me as someone who does what she's told. What makes you say that? She testified against Nexacorp when every person at her level would have found a reason not to. Monica started the engine. She already knows how to choose the harder thing. We just have to give her the truth to choose it with. Monica and Brian didn't sleep that night. Or the night after. They worked the way Monica had learned to work on the cases that actually mattered systematically, without deciding in advance where the evidence was supposed to lead, following it wherever it went, and letting that determine the shape of what they were building. Day one. They pulled every piece of security footage from the Grand Atlantic Hotel. Parking garage levels 1 through 4, side entrance, service corridor, elevator banks, all 14 exterior cameras, covering the full block perimeter. 13 of the 14 exterior cameras had been functioning on the night of the gala. The one that wasn't the one experiencing what the hotel's security director described as intermittent recording issues covered the specific strap and the sidewall of the building. The exact spot where Darnell had heard Jeffrey Lewis and Gary Young talking. The fault had been logged on October 28th, 11 days before the gala. A work order had been submitted the following morning. The work order had not been completed. Monica looked at the maintenance records. Then at Brian, camera develops a fault 11 days before the event, she said. Could be coincidence. Could be. They pulled the records on who had initiated the work order. Cross-referenced with the guest services department. Found that the maintenance request had followed a phone call to the hotel's events coordination line on October 28th. A caller, who identified themselves as representing the gala's organizing committee, asking detailed questions about the security setup for the event. The event's coordinator was a 26-year-old named Dana, who had been in the role for 2 years and who had been thoroughly helpful and professional in answering every question. She'd described the camera positions. She'd mentioned, in passing, that the side parking camera had been intermittently problematic. She'd had no reason to think twice about the call. She had no way to know that the organizing committee's office had not made it. Monica and Brian told her this carefully and gently, and made sure she understood that nothing that had happened was her fault. She cried anyway. Monica sat with her until she was done. Day 2. They found the tickets. Jeffrey Lewis and Gary Young had entered the gala using tickets purchased under the names Robert Cole and James Perry, real names, real Illinois residents, both living in Evanston. Neither man had any connection to Lewis, Young, or Nexacorp. Both of their wallets had been stolen in the 6 weeks preceding the gala, one from a gym locker in Evanston, one from a restaurant coat check in Andersonville. Neither theft had been reported to police because neither man had noticed specific cards missing, just the cards that turned out to have been used to purchase 2 tickets to a $500 a plate charity event. Monica looked at the full timeline laid out on her desk, wallets targeted and lifted weeks in advance. The camera inquiry call on October 28th, the financial transfer on October 14th. This wasn't improvised. Someone had found the gala date on Sandra Anderson's public calendar and started working backward from it, putting each piece in place with enough lead time that nothing would look rushed or sloppy. While Brian was on the phone with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, Monica got a call from the Grand Atlantic's head of security, parking garage camera, level 2 east exit. Timestamp 8:49 p.m. A pause. Your 2 subjects going to their vehicle. Best face capture quality of anything from that night. Rental plates different name, paid cash, but the faces are clean. Monica was already reaching for her jacket. 2 minutes after they'd walked away from the gala entrance. 90 seconds after Darnell Cooper was tackled, day 3. With high-resolution face captures from the parking garage, Monica went back to the hotel staff. Every person who'd worked the event, catering, security, coat check, valet, housekeeping, 19 interviews over the course of the day before she found what she was looking for. The valet attendant working the east side of the parking structure was a young man named Deshawn, who had a good memory for faces. Yeah, I saw them. He looked at the photographs without hesitation. Earlier, before most guests arrived, they came through the east lot, asked me which entrance the event was using. What time? 6:15, maybe 6:30. Before the main rush, did they say anything else? He thought about it carefully. The taller one asked about camera coverage on the south side of the building. Said he was a security consultant doing a walkthrough for the event. Monica kept her expression neutral. Did he show credentials? No, I didn't ask. He looked like he belonged there. A pause. Was I supposed to ask? You did everything correctly, Monica said. And she meant it. She needed him calm enough to testify. Jeffrey Lewis and Gary Young had vanished. Lewis's apartment in Pilsen had been cleared out methodically, not hastily, which would have left traces, but carefully, over what the building superintendent estimated was a few hours. Young's registered address in Wicker Park turned out to be a unit rented under a name that wasn't his, already vacated before Monica and Brian arrived. Both phones had gone dark, not switched off, but deactivated, SIM cards pulled and discarded. Someone told them we were looking, Brian said. Standing outside Young's empty building. Yes, inside? Monica considered the building's facade. Doesn't have to be inside the department. Anyone in a position to notice that 2 specific faces were being run through databases. She turned back toward the car. It doesn't change what we have. What we have is circumstantial. What we have is a documented financial link between 2 career violent criminals and the CEO of a company facing federal prosecution. We have those 2 men entering a high-security event under stolen identities. We have them scouting camera positions 11 days in advance under a false professional cover. We have them on parking garage footage leaving 90 seconds after their approach was disrupted. And we have a witness whose account is internally consistent with every piece of physical evidence we've found. She got into the car. The only thing missing is Lewis and Young themselves, which is the main thing. It's one thing. There's something else that matters more right now. She started the engine. Sandra Anderson. Brian pulled his door shut. Anderson. On the drive back, Monica's phone buzzed with a text from a contact in Memphis. She glanced at it, then set the phone down without responding. She'd deal with Memphis when she had Anderson. Monica called the Beacon Med main line and was transferred 3 times before reaching Sandra's executive assistant, who told her politely and firmly that Dr. Anderson was not available to outside callers. Tell her it's Detective Monica Reed, Organized Crime Division, Chicago PD, Monica said. Tell her I have specific information about the two men who were moving toward her in that entrance before Darnell Cooper intervened. And tell her I believe she already knows something about what I'm going to tell her. 40 seconds of hold music, Detective Reed. Dr. Anderson will meet with you today at 3 o'clock. She's suggesting a location away from the building. Sandra had chosen a coffee house in Lincoln Park, a quiet corner booth establishment where she could arrive without drawing attention. Monica understood the choice immediately. Beacon Med's offices meant attorneys present, and attorneys present meant everything filtered through liability calculations. Sandra Anderson, Monica had concluded, was not currently in a filtered mood. She was right. Sandra arrived 2 minutes early. No security detail, no assistant, no Thomas Jackson. She was wearing a dark coat and a gray scarf and glasses she probably replaced with contacts for most professional appearances. Without any of the markers of the woman in the Forbes profiles and the business press photographs, she looked like someone who had been thinking very hard without stopping for 3 days straight. She looked, Monica thought, like a woman who was ready to hear something true. They sat in the corner booth. Monica ordered coffee. Sandra ordered water and didn't touch it. Monica opened the folder she'd brought and set the photographs down first. Jeffrey Lewis. Gary Young, do you recognize these men? Sandra looked at them for a long moment. The careful, precise look of someone confirming something they'd already begun to suspect rather than encountering something new. Yes, she said. They were in the crowd, moving toward me. Just before it happened, they were moving toward you with purpose. Yes, she looked up. I was in the process of turning to look at them directly when everything happened. Their names are Jeffrey Lewis and Gary Young. Monica laid out the criminal records. Lewis has 3 arrests for violent crimes, 0 convictions. In each case, the primary witness became unavailable before trial. She laid out the financial document. 14 days before the gala, $12. $400 was transferred from a shell company that we've traced back to a Nexacorp subsidiary account. Into Lewis's bank account, Sandra sat completely still. She read each document the way she'd clearly been trained to read things, not performing comprehension but actually achieving it, working through the material before drawing conclusions. When she looked up, her eyes had changed. Not surprise. She'd been building toward this understanding for 3 days. But there's a difference between what you suspect and what you can see documented in front of you. Confirmation has weight that suspicion doesn't. Scott Hill sent them, she said. We believe so. We can't yet prove the direct instruction, but the financial trail is clear and the connection to Nexacorp is documented. He told me I'd regret it. Her voice was quiet and completely level. When we left the grand jury room, he said it in the corridor. Loud enough that I could hear him, not so loud that anyone else would particularly notice. She looked at the table. I thought it was the kind of thing frightened, powerful men say when they realize they've lost. I didn't think he meant it as an operational statement, Dr. Anderson. Monica leaned forward slightly. Darnell Cooper heard Lewis and Young planning this. He tried to warn your security team and wasn't as taken seriously either time. The only remaining option was something dramatic enough to destroy the timing of whatever they had planned. Sandra looked at her. He saved my life, she said, not quite a question. The tone of a statement that has been waiting to be said out loud for 3 days, and is finally being said. We believe he intervened in a planned attack. We can't say with certainty what Lewis and Young intended to do once they reached you, but given their histories and the financial link to a CEO, facing federal prosecution with your testimony as the linchpin, we believe the threat was serious. Sandra was quiet for a moment. And he's in a holding cell. Yes, because he destroyed my dress. Yes, while the men who were actually there to harm me are gone. We're actively working to locate them. There's a sighting in Memphis that I'm following up. Sandra looked out the window at the ordinary Chicago afternoon happening on the other side of the glass. People walking fast against the cold. A city bus pulling into traffic. A woman with a stroller negotiating the curb. All of it indifferent and continuous and completely unaware of what was sitting on this table. My COO told me this morning that if I publicly connect myself to Darnell Cooper, it will compromise my credibility in the Nexacorp trial, Sandra said. Her voice was even, not resigned, just factual. Thomas Jackson told me any statement I make can and will be used by Nexacorp's defense team to characterize me as emotionally compromised. Victor Bryant told me, very directly, that my position at Beacon Med is contingent on my not creating additional complications for the company. A pause. He didn't use those exact words. But that was the content. Those are real concerns, Monica said. I won't pretend they aren't. Thomas's exact words were, Sandra, you've already done the right thing by cooperating with the FBI. You don't need to take on any more exposure. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. Sandra picked up the photograph of Jeffrey Lewis and looked at it. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, Monica said nothing. She'd learned, across 20 years, that the things worth choosing were the ones people arrived at on their own. You couldn't push someone toward the true thing and have it stick. They had to find it themselves. Sandra set the photograph down. The fraud Nexacorp committed that $67 million it came from community hospital budgets. South Side, West Side. From the people in this city with the least margin. That's what I testified about, because it was what was true and it mattered. She was quiet for a moment. Darnell Cooper has been sleeping on the streets of this same city, on the same South Side streets that Nexacorp was draining. He saw something dangerous. He tried to tell people. No one listened to him, because of what he looked like and where he slept. She looked at Monica directly. And then he did the only thing left to him. And he's in a cell while the men who were actually going to hurt me are in Memphis or wherever they've gotten to. Monica held her eyes. He didn't calculate the cost first, Sandra said. He just did it. Something settled in her expression, the specific settling that comes when a decision stops being a decision and becomes something else. Something already made. I have accountants and attorneys and communications professionals calculating the cost for me right now, all of them telling me to be careful, to protect myself. To think about the long game, she paused, and I keep thinking what would have happened if Darnell Cooper had calculated the cost first. What do you need from me? She asked. I need you to testify at his trial, about what you saw that night, about the 2 men, about what this investigation has found. Thomas Jackson is going to tell me not to. I know. Victor Bryant is going to follow through on what he implied this morning. He may. And it might actually give Nexacorp's defense team something to work with. It might, Monica said. I won't tell you otherwise. Sandra was quiet for one more moment. But if I don't, she said, then a man who put himself between me and serious harm goes to prison for it. Yes. The word landed and stayed there. Then Sandra Anderson straightened in her seat. The small, precise movement of someone whose calculating is finished. Tell me exactly what I need to do, she said. Monica drove back toward the precinct in the early dark of a Chicago November afternoon. Brian called before she reached the expressway. Lewis was spotted, he said. Memphis. Traffic camera on I-240. About an hour ago, get it to Memphis PD tonight. Federal warrant application, we have enough for it. Already drafted and waiting for your signature. She thought about Andre Williams's photograph on her shelf. About what it felt like to be too late. About what it felt like to not be. Brian, she said. Yeah. We're going to get this one right. A pause. Yeah, he said. I know we are. The courthouse on 26th and California is not a beautiful building. It is large and gray and built for function, rather than impression, designed to process things efficiently. Not to make anyone feel good about being there. Cases, motions, people whose lives have arrived at a point where a building like this becomes necessary. It does not care about any of them individually. Darnell Cooper had been inside it twice before. Once at 24, a minor citation that was dismissed without consequence. Once at 29, 3 weeks after the accident, when he'd had to sign paperwork related to the truck driver's case. He remembered that second visit the way you remember things that happen. While you're still in shock, the hard bench in the corridor, 4 hours of waiting, lawyers moving past with briefcases, and the professional expressions of people who had somewhere more important to be. A system processing a tragedy into documents. Today he was the document. He was brought in through the side entrance at 8:31 a.m. Orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed in front of him, which his attorney had requested as a small courtesy the court had granted. A guard on each side. The walk from the holding area to courtroom 406 was 63 steps, and he counted them because counting was something to do that wasn't thinking about what came next. The courtroom was already full when he walked in. He felt it before he saw it, the particular compressed density of a room where too many people are, working to stay quiet at the same time. The press section along the back wall was packed shoulder to shoulder. Camera operators lined the side walls, their equipment permitted by the judge after lengthy consideration of a case that had become, in 3 weeks, something far larger than its original facts. The Darnell Cooper case had spent those 3 weeks as the kind of story the internet argued about in shifts. The original video, 14 seconds, multiple angles, watched 31 million times, still generated hundreds of new comments every hour. 2 entrenched camps, neither one listening to the other. The people who had decided from the first viewing that a homeless man attacking a billionaire was exactly what it appeared to be and required no further examination. And the people who had watched Monica Reed's press statement 6 days ago, 2 careful minutes of documented facts about Jeffrey Lewis and Gary Young, and had begun asking different questions. The press statement hadn't said Darnell Cooper was innocent. It hadn't needed to. The internet had built that conclusion from the materials provided and had argued about it loudly ever since, which meant this courtroom was full of people who had already decided something. The question was only which version of something. Darnell sat down beside Kevin Moore. Kevin Moore was 35 years old, public defender, 3rd year in this specific role. He had the particular energy of someone running on less sleep than was medically advisable, the focused, slightly over-alert quality of a person who has been reading documents until 3 in the morning for 6 consecutive nights, which he had. Darnell knew this because Kevin Moore had come to the holding facility every single day for the past week, bringing materials, asking questions, and listening in the specific way that Darnell had learned over 3 years of being not listened to recognize and value. "How are you holding up?" Kevin asked quietly, setting his folders in order without looking up. "I'm here," Darnell said, which was the accurate answer. Kevin glanced at him. "Sandra Anderson confirmed 45 minutes ago. She's in the building." Darnell looked at the front of the courtroom. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything adequate to say about a woman he had never spoken to, whose most valuable possession he had destroyed in front of 300 people and 31 million video viewers, who had every professional and financial and legal reason to stay as far from this courtroom as her attorneys could place her coming anyway. He thought about what that cost, not the money kind of cost, the other kind. The judge entered. The courtroom rose. The Honorable Diane Watkins was 61 years old and had been on this bench for 22 years, which meant she had presided over enough cases to have stopped being impressed by the weight of any particular one. She took her seat, arranged her materials, and looked at the room with the practical attention of someone who intended to run an efficient proceeding. "We're on the record in the matter of the people versus Darnell Cooper," she said. "Are both parties ready to proceed?" Both parties were. Stephanie Harris had been with the Cook County DA's office for 17 years and had a conviction record her supervisors described as exceptional. She was 42 years old and moved through a courtroom with the ease of someone who had stopped noticing the specific room a long time ago and just worked the space, whatever space it happened to be. She opened without theatrics. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you are about to consider is not complicated. I want to say that directly, at the start, because you're going to hear things today that are designed to make it seem complicated. My job this morning is to show you what actually happened. She picked up the remote from the prosecution table. The screen at the front of the courtroom came alive on the evening of November 12th. At approximately 8:23 p.m., Darnell Cooper, the defendant, ran through a crowd of guests at a charity gala at the Grand Atlantic Hotel and physically attacked Dr. Sandra Anderson. A private citizen attending a lawful event, she pressed play. The video filled the screen. At this size, in this room, it was different from watching it on a phone. Larger, more immediate. The sound of the fabric tearing came through the courtroom speakers with a clarity that made several jurors visibly react. Darnell watched himself run, watched himself grab, watched Sandra Anderson fall. He kept his face neutral. It required sustained effort. What you just watched, Stephanie Harris said, is not open to interpretation. It is documented on multiple cameras from multiple angles, witnessed by 300 individuals, and represents one of the most thoroughly recorded incidents in recent Chicago legal history. She set the remote down. You'll hear from the defense that Mr. Cooper had reasons for what he did, that there were other people present whose behavior is now under investigation, that Mr. Cooper was, in some sense, acting protectively. She turned to face the jury directly. The prosecution's position is this: whatever Mr. Cooper believed he was doing, whatever internal rationale he has constructed, the documented facts are unambiguous. He ran at Dr. Anderson. He grabbed her. He caused physical harm and destroyed $47,000 worth of property. All of it witnessed, all of it recorded, all of it clear. She sat down. Kevin Moore stood. He didn't have Stephanie Harris's ease. He was younger and less certain in the room, and there was something slightly deliberate about his movements, a man who knew exactly what he needed to do, and was focused on doing it rather than on how it looked. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. "The defense will show you what Ms. Harris's presentation left out," he said. "Specifically, we'll show you the part of the video that nobody, until 6 days ago, had looked at carefully enough." Monica Reed took the stand at 10:23 a.m. She had testified in court more times than she could recall specifically, which had produced in her a particular settled quality on the witness stand, the quality of someone who understood that testimony was a transfer of information, not a performance. You got it wrong when you started thinking about how you were coming across. You got it right when you fixed on what was true, and said that clearly. Kevin Moore walked her through the evidence methodically, piece by piece, giving each element enough time to land before moving to the next. The third video, the one from the catering staff member on the side steps, the elevated angle. He showed it to the jury on the same large screen Harris had used. Let them watch it. Paused it on the two figures in the upper frame. Gave them 30 full seconds of silence to look. Jeffrey Lewis's criminal record, the 3 arrests, the 0 convictions, the pattern of witnesses becoming unavailable. His documented prior relationship with Nexacorp, Gary Young's record. The overlapping associations. The witness intimidation conviction. The financial transfer. October 14th. $12,400 from Meridian Protective Services, LLC, to Jeffrey Lewis. The paper trail connecting Meridian back to a Nexacorp subsidiary account. The hotel camera sabotage timeline. The fraudulent phone call on October 28th. The work order that was submitted and never completed. The stolen identities used to purchase event tickets. Robert Cole and James Perry. Both Evanston residents, neither with any connection to the event. The parking garage footage. Timestamp 8:49 p.m. Lewis and Young at their vehicle. 90 seconds after Darnell Cooper was tackled, he laid it out piece by piece, and Darnell watched the jury's faces as each piece arrived. Juror 3, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, had started the morning with her arms crossed and her expression set. By the time Monica reached the financial records, her arms were in her lap. By the parking garage footage, she was leaning slightly forward with the specific attention of someone re-examining something they'd thought they understood. Juror 7, a man about Darnell's age, who had looked at the defense table with careful neutrality at the start of the day, was now looking at the evidence screen with his pen moving slowly across his notepad. Stephanie Harris's cross-examination of Monica was precise and direct, Detective Reed. You have not apprehended Jeffrey Lewis or Gary Young, that is correct. No weapons were recovered at the scene, correct. You cannot tell this jury with certainty what Lewis and Young intended to do that evening. I can tell the jury what the totality of the evidence indicates. Yes or no, Detective? Can you tell this jury with certainty what those two men intended to do? A pause. No, so the foundation of the defense's case, Stephanie Harris said, is a theory, perhaps a carefully researched theory. But a theory? Monica looked at her without any change of expression. What we have, she said, is a documented financial connection between two men with histories of violent crime and witness intimidation, and the CEO of a company whose federal fraud prosecution depends on Sandra Anderson's testimony. We have physical evidence of those two men entering a secured event under stolen identities. We have testimony that they scouted camera positions 11 days before the event under a false professional cover. We have footage of them moving toward Dr. Anderson and leaving the premises 90 seconds after their approach was interrupted. If that constitutes a theory, it is a theory with substantial documented evidence beneath every claim. Stephanie Harris looked at her for a moment. Nothing further, she said. The lunch recess lasted 50 minutes. When the courtroom reconvened, something in the room's quality had changed the specific difference between a room full of people who are waiting for something to begin and a room full of people who have already begun to understand something and are waiting for the rest of it to arrive. Kevin Moore stood. The defense calls Dr. Sandra Anderson. The room went still. Not the performance of quiet. The actual thing, the specific held quality of 300 people understanding at the same moment that something important was about to happen. Sandra entered from the side door. No jewelry except small gold earrings. A charcoal gray suit, simple cut. Her hair natural and shaped close, the way Darnell had seen it in the photographs that had accompanied every business profile written about her. She walked to the witness stand with the same ease she'd had walking into the Grand Atlantic Hotel 3 weeks ago. The ease hadn't changed. But there was something beneath it today that hadn't been there then. A weight that belonged to someone who had made a decision that cost something real and had decided to carry the cost without making a performance of it. She was sworn in. She sat down, and for the first time since 8:23 p.m. on November 12th, Darnell Cooper and Sandra Anderson were in the same room. He looked at her. She looked at him. One moment, just one, before she turned to face Kevin Moore. He couldn't have said what passed between them in that moment. Not forgiveness, that wasn't the right word for something this complicated. Not gratitude yet either. Something more basic than either. The acknowledgement of two people who had been through something together without knowing each other and who were now in the same room, knowing what it had been. Then she turned to Kevin Moore and the moment was done. Dr. Anderson, Kevin began, his voice careful and even. Please tell the court what you remember about the evening of November 12th. Sandra described it without embellishment or performance. The car ride, the arrival, the cameras, the crowd, the entrance. She was specific where specificity mattered, and did not add color where it wasn't needed. She was not performing victimhood. She was not performing resilience. She was just telling what had happened, and the plainness of it had its own considerable weight. In the moments immediately before Mr. Cooper reached you, what do you remember? Sandra paused. Not because she didn't know, because she was choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that what she said here was going to matter. I remember two men, she said. The courtroom was completely silent. They were in the crowd to my left, moving toward me. I was in the process of turning my head to look at them directly when Mr. Cooper came through the crowd. Can you describe how they were moving? Purposeful. Direct. Not the way guests move through a crowded entrance, not the movement of people trying to find their table or reach the bar. They were looking at me, and moving toward me with clear intention. Their hands, she stopped for a fraction of a second. Their arms were positioned in a way that wasn't consistent with just walking, and after Mr. Cooper reached you, I fell. I was on the floor. When I was able to look up and process what was happening around me, I scanned the crowd. She paused. Those two men were gone. The crowd had compressed, people moving closer to see what had happened, some people backing away, some people frozen. But those two specific men who had been moving toward me with clear purpose 30 seconds earlier were not there. Kevin Moore turned to the evidence screen, pulled up the parking garage footage. Timestamp, 8:49 p.m. Dr. Anderson, do you recognize the individuals in this footage? Sandra looked at the screen. Yes, those are the two men who were moving toward me. Thank you. Nothing further. Stephanie Harris rose. She took a moment, a professional beat of recalibration, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Sandra Anderson was the complaining witness. You did not attack the complaining witness, but you could question the reliability of her perception, Dr. Anderson. The evening of November 12th was clearly a traumatic experience. It was disorienting, Sandra said. I'd be cautious about the word traumatic, a slight recalibration from Harris. You experienced a physical incident. Someone grabbed my dress and I fell, Sandra said calmly. I understand that has a legal characterization. I'm describing my physical experience of it. The two men you've described were unable to identify them in the immediate aftermath. Correct, you were focused on the event, on your arrival, on the cameras and the crowd. Yes. So your memory of these men, of their specific movement and positioning, is a memory formed during significant confusion and stress. My memory of them was formed in the 2 or 3 seconds before any confusion existed, Sandra said. What happened after Mr. Cooper reached me was disorienting. What was happening before was not. I was walking into a building. The crowd was pressing normally, and in my peripheral vision, two men were moving toward me in a way that didn't match how other people around them were moving. That observation happened before anything chaotic occurred. Harris moved to a different angle. Dr. Anderson, you are the primary witness in an upcoming federal fraud case against Nexacorp Industries. Yes. And today you are here testifying in support of a man whose actions were physically harmful to you. His actions caused me to fall and destroyed a dress, Sandra said. Yes. And you don't find it relevant from a credibility standpoint that your appearance here today could be characterized as emotional rather than rational decision-making. Sandra looked at Stephanie Harris directly. Unhurried, without heat, I find it relevant that a man who appears to have intervened between me and two professional criminals hired to harm me is sitting in this courtroom facing prison, she said. That is what I find relevant. I am here because it is true that those two men were moving toward me, and it is true that Darnell Cooper interrupted that. And it is true that nobody asked him a single question about his reasons before the city decided what had happened. She turned slightly toward the jury, not performing it, just including them naturally. I am not here because my attorneys recommended it. My attorneys strongly recommended the opposite. I am here because the truth of what happened that night deserves to be in this record, and I am the person who saw it. Stephanie Harris held her gaze for a moment. Nothing can further, she said. The recess after Sandra's testimony was 20 minutes. Darnell sat in the small room off the corridor with Kevin Moore, who was reviewing notes with the focused efficiency of a man not allowing himself to feel anything yet about how things were going. She didn't have to do that, Darnell said. Kevin looked up. No, he said. She didn't. Her board threatened her position. Yes, her lawyers told her it would hurt the other case. It might a little. Kevin set his pen down. Nexacorp's defense team will try to use today to characterize her as emotionally invested. It probably won't land. Her testimony in the federal case is backed by 2 years of forensic audit data, not just her word. But they'll attempt it. Darnell looked at the wall. She knew all of that, he said. Yes, and she came anyway. Kevin was quiet for a moment, then, Darnell, I see people make the self-protective choice in this job every day. It's the normal choice. It makes sense. Most of the time I don't even fault people for it. He paused. Sandra Anderson made a different one. That's all. She came anyway. Darnell thought about 30 seconds on a cold pavement outside the Grand Atlantic Hotel. About the calculation he had made in the space of 2 seconds, the cost of acting against the cost of not acting, and what he'd chosen and why. He thought, people actually do it. Not in stories. Not in the abstract. In real rooms, in real cities, on real afternoons when it costs them something real. People choose the harder true thing. Not always, not most of the time. But sometimes they do. The jury was out for 97 minutes. Darnell sat in the holding area with Kevin Moore and didn't talk. There wasn't much left to say. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Everything that could be argued had been argued. Now there was only the particular quality of time that exists between trying and knowing, the 97 minutes that can't be shortened or filled, that have to be lived through at their own pace. Darnell had spent a lot of time in spaces like this over the past 3 years. The space between trying and knowing, between the night of the accident and the morning after it, between being seen and being looked through. He'd gotten competent at enduring that space, if not exactly comfortable in it. He thought about Emma, about her saying that giraffes were her favorite because they were tall enough to see everything. I saw it, Em, he thought. I was tall enough. The guard appeared at the door. Jury's back. 97 minutes. The courtroom had refilled. Word had moved through the building that the jury was returning, and people had come back from wherever they'd gone during deliberation to see how this ended. Darnell walked in and sat down and kept his eyes on the seal above the judge's bench. Kevin Moore had told him not to try to read the verdict in the jurors' faces because you were almost always wrong, and it made the remaining seconds worse. Judge Watkins looked at the jury foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of assault in the 2nd degree, how does the jury find? The foreperson, a man in his mid-40s with a careful, deliberate voice, looked at the paper in his hand. We, the jury, find the defendant, Darnell Cooper, not guilty. The room moved, not erupted, moved. The specific collective exhale of a space full of people releasing something they'd been holding. Several people in the press section were already typing. Someone behind Darnell made a sound that wasn't quite a word. On the charge of criminal destruction of property, not guilty. On the charge of disorderly conduct, not guilty. Judge Watkins brought her gavel down. Once. Firm, the defendant is acquitted on all counts. Mr. Cooper, you are free to go. Your record in connection with these charges will be expunged in full. The court thanks the jury for their service and their attention. She looked at Darnell briefly, not warmly, not coldly, just directly. You may go, Mr. Cooper. Kevin Moore turned to him. He looked like he wanted to say something that would be adequate to the moment. Instead, he put his hand on Darnell's shoulder. Briefly, firmly, which was more adequate than any words would have been. The guard came and removed the handcuffs. Darnell sat for a moment after they came off, looking at his wrists. At the marks the metal had left in the skin, he thought about all the ways a person could be bound. Not all of them were made of metal. Some of them were the story someone else told about you, before you had a chance to tell your own. Some of them were 3 years of being looked through in a city of nearly 3 million people. He stood up. Sandra Anderson was near the back of the courtroom, standing apart from the people moving toward exits. She hadn't left during deliberation. She'd stayed through all 97 minutes, which told Darnell something about the nature of her patience that he filed away. He walked toward her. The crowd thinned naturally around them as he approached. The specific social instinct people have to give space to a moment that looks like it belongs to 2 people. The space between them felt quieter than he'd expected. He'd imagined this moment during the long nights in the holding facility, had imagined it as something dramatic, something with a clear emotional shape. It wasn't. It was just 2 people standing close enough to speak at a normal volume, both of them carrying the weight of the same 3 weeks. I'm sorry, Sandra said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes carried something more complicated than her voice could hold. For not asking sooner. For not questioning what I saw that night. For letting 3 weeks go by. Darnell looked at her. You didn't know, he said. I know I didn't know. That's not the same thing as it being all right. He considered that. No, he agreed. It's not the same thing. A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable. Just the particular silence of people taking time with what's real. But you came, Darnell said, when it mattered, when it cost you something specific. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. What you did that night cost you everything you had, she said. The least I could give you was one afternoon in a courtroom. He almost smiled. She reached into her bag, drew out an envelope, held it toward him with the directness of someone who had decided not to make a ceremony of this. Before you open it, whatever. Number is on. That check is not enough. I want to say that clearly. There isn't a number that would be. He took the envelope, opened it, looked at the check, $100,000. He looked back up at her. Use it to get stable, she said. An apartment, clothes. Whatever comes first. And then, if you want to consider it, I'd like to talk to you about a position at Beacon Med. He looked at her carefully. My company has a security consulting gap that I've needed to fill for 8 months, Sandra said. I just spent 3 weeks learning that the most effective security instincts I've ever encountered belong to a man who developed them sleeping on pavement. That's not a thing I'm going to ignore. She held his gaze. Don't answer now. Think about it. Call me. She held out a card with her direct number. Then she extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and direct, the handshake of someone who meant it. He walked out of the courtroom into the corridor. Monica Reed was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. When she saw him, she straightened up without making a production of it. She didn't smile. Monica Reed, Darnell had come to understand over the past 3 weeks, was not a frequent smiler, but her eyes did something. Free man, she said. Free man, he agreed. She nodded once, looked at him steadily. Don't waste it, she said. Then she turned and walked back into the courtroom, where Brian Thompson was waiting with coffee and almost certainly a new development in the search for Gary Young. Darnell watched her go, then he walked toward the exit, toward the door, toward outside. The first night after the trial, Darnell stayed in a hotel that Sandra had arranged, a quiet place near Lincoln Park. Nothing elaborate. Just clean and warm and private. He stood in the shower for 22 minutes. Not because he required 22 minutes, but because hot water was available, and his body hadn't learned yet to take it for granted. He lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling, white plaster, completely still. No wind finding gaps in a tarp, no traffic sounds through cardboard. No ambient noise of other people doing their own version of surviving the night nearby. Just quiet. He expected to fall asleep immediately. He didn't. He lay there until 4 a.m. because the quiet was wrong, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar in a way his nervous system didn't know how to process. 3 years of necessary vigilance doesn't stand down because the circumstances have changed. His body was still watching, still listening, still waiting for the thing that required attention. At 4:17 a.m., he picked up his phone. Monica Reed had put a number in it before he left the precinct the night of the holding cell interview. She'd written on the back of a card, "They answer at night." Use it, he called. A woman answered on the second ring. She didn't mention the time or make any sound that suggested the time was unusual. She said, "You reached the right place. I'm here." He talked for 40 minutes. He didn't solve anything in those 40 minutes. But he made it to morning. And in that specific period of his life, making it to morning was the whole task. The apartment in Logan Square cost $1,200 a month. He found it through a non-profit. Monica had connected him to an organization that helped people transitioning out of homelessness navigate the practical maze of first and last month's deposit requirements, references, credit check workarounds, the 20 specific obstacles between a check for $100,000 and a signed lease. He would not have found his way through that maze alone, and he understood that knowing where to ask for help was itself a skill he was building. third floor of a building that smelled like old wood and other people's cooking. One bedroom, a kitchen window looking at the brick wall of the building next door. Small enough that he could see all of it from the doorway. He stood in the middle of it on the day he got the keys and tried to make it real in his body the fact that the lock worked and he had the only key and no one could tell him to leave. That this specific air, in this specific space, was something he was allowed to come back to. It took a while. Some things have to be felt before they're believed. He bought a bed, a table, 2 chairs. He stood in front of the refrigerated section of the grocery store for longer than made sense, trying to remember how this worked. What a person bought when they had a kitchen and intended to use it. He bought milk, bread, apples. Then, moving through the baking aisle without having planned to, he bought butter and flour and cinnamon and sugar. The pie didn't work. The crust was too thick and the filling was too liquid. And the kitchen didn't smell the way the kitchen in East Atlanta had smelled on Sunday afternoons. Of course it didn't. He ate a piece of it at his table anyway. It tasted like effort. He decided that was enough for now. His neighbor knocked the next morning. He'd heard her moving around through the wall the night before, quiet, domestic sounds. A television on low, a cat occasionally audible. She was 68 years old. Silver hair. Eyes that held the specific warmth that belongs to people who have lived long enough to choose kindness deliberately, rather than by default. She handed him a container of chocolate chip cookies. "I heard someone moved in," she said. "I'm Lorraine Mitchell, 3B, Darnell Cooper, 3A. She looked at him with the ordinary attention of a person meeting a neighbor, not recognition, not the particular look that had followed him for 3 weeks since the video. Just the simple human attention of someone being introduced to someone new. "Welcome to the building, Darnell Cooper," she said. He stood in his doorway holding the container. He didn't say anything for a moment, not because words weren't available, but because 2 of them had just landed somewhere that needed a second to process them properly. Welcome. Not a word the world had been directing at him for a long time. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. Lorraine," she said. "Mrs. Mitchell was my mother-in-law. Knock if you need anything." Her cat Chester, he learned later, a grey tabby with strong opinions about draft locations, appeared and inspected Darnell through the gap under her door before she closed it. He went inside. Sat at his table. Ate 1 cookie. It was very good, he thought. This is what it feels like when ordinary decency shows up. Not the $100,000 check or the not guilty verdict or the newspaper stories, with different headlines than the ones before. Just a 68-year-old woman with a container of cookies and a cat named Chester who looked at him and saw a neighbor. He sat there for a while. Then he called Dr. Daniel Brooks's office and scheduled his first appointment. Dr. Brooks worked out of a small office in Wicker Park, unhurried, 50 years old, with a kind of face that held information without advertising it. He specialized in PTSD and trauma recovery. Monica had given Darnell his name without pressure. "He's good. Up to you." The first session was 40 minutes of Darnell explaining the accident, while Dr. Brooks mostly listened and asked simple questions. Not complicated questions designed to demonstrate therapeutic insight, just the questions you need answered to understand a sequence of events. What were you doing right before it happened? What's the first thing you remember after? At the end of the session, Dr. Brooks said, "You've been managing significant trauma for 3 years without any support structure? Yes, that takes substantial energy. Constant energy. Yes, it works to a degree. People sustain it." He paused. "But it costs you whether you're accounting for it or not." Darnell thought about the 4 a.m. ceilings, about the dreams that came when his vigilance lapsed, about the specific weight that lived in his chest on certain mornings. "I know," he said. "The goal isn't to stop feeling it," Dr. Brooks said. "The goal is to stop carrying it without any help." The second session was harder than the first. The third was harder than the second, because Emma came up in the third session. And when she came up, Darnell didn't redirect the way he had been redirecting for 3 years. He stayed with it. He told Dr. Brooks about the giraffes, about the Sunday kitchen smell. About her voice, the specific pitch of it, the way she said his name with the emphasis landing wrong in a way that was entirely hers. The way she began sentences with Darnell, did you know that, as if she'd been sitting on the information and couldn't wait on the information and couldn't wait any longer to share it. He got through all of it without stopping. For the first time in 3 years, he got through all of it. He sat in his car afterward for 10 minutes before he felt ready to drive. Not because he was falling apart, the opposite, because something that had been carried a specific way for 3 years had shifted, and his body needed a moment to understand the new weight distribution. He thought, this is what it means to put something down, not to lose it, not to forget it, not to stop loving the people it's about, just to stop carrying it alone in the dark where no one can help you with it. He went to Beaconmed on a Wednesday morning. He wore a suit he'd bought secondhand from a shop in Ukrainian village that specialized in professional clothing for people re-entering the workforce. It fit reasonably well. He'd stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a while before leaving, looking for the person he'd been at 29 in the face, looking back at him. Not finding that person exactly. Finding someone shaped by different years. Someone he didn't fully recognize yet, but was beginning to. He decided that was all right. You didn't have to recognize yourself to show up. The security guard at Beaconmed's main desk was a man named Raymond Harris, mid-50s, who stood when Darnell approached and put out his hand before Darnell had introduced himself. Mr. Cooper, Dr. Anderson told us to expect you. Darnell shook his hand. Welcome to Beaconmed, Raymond said. There it was again. That word. Still doing the same thing to him every time. Sandra met him at the elevator and walked him through the building at her working pace, efficient, purposeful, the version of her that existed in motion rather than in courtrooms or corner coffee booths. She introduced him to people whose names he tried to hold, showed him the office. Small, with a window looking at the brick building across the alley, a desk and a chair and a computer, and enough space to work without feeling crowded. He sat down, put his hands flat on the desk surface. Real. Solid. Security consulting here is specific, Sandra said from the doorway. I need someone who thinks about this building the way a person would think about it if they weren't supposed to be in it. Where are the gaps? Where are the angles that the cameras miss? What does this place look like from outside? I know what that looks like, Darnell said. I know you do, she paused. That's why you're here. His first report, delivered at the end of week 1, ran 7 pages. He had found a camera blind spot in the parking garage produced by the sweep angle of the rotating mount, 4.7 seconds of dead coverage on every rotation cycle, enough for an unobserved crossing. A side entrance door habitually propped open with a fold piece of cardboard during shift change windows, a habit that had been in place, based on the wear pattern on the door frame, for well over a year. Sandra's departure times were predictable to within a 15-minute window, based on her publicly posted speaking and event schedule. The delivery entrance received no systematic background verification on drivers. Brian Thompson, now contracted to Beaconmed as a security advisor, read the report and set it down on Monica's car dashboard. When she showed it to him, the prop door, he said, his team has been living with that for over a year. He sees it differently, Monica said, because he spent 3 years looking for ways into places that didn't want him. Same skill set, she said. Different application. She started the engine. Turns out that's worth something. 6 months after the trial, Jeffrey Lewis was arrested in Memphis, Tennessee, routine traffic stop. Different car, different name, but the face matched the federal warrant cleanly. He was extradited to Chicago and charged with conspiracy to commit assault, witness tampering, and criminal solicitation. Scott Hill's legal team immediately issued statements distancing Nexacorp from Lewis in every possible direction. It didn't hold. Monica and Brian had spent 6 months building the financial trail into something that didn't have gaps. Scott Hill was indicted 10 weeks after Lewis's arrest. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, witness intimidation, solicitation of assault. The charges stood alongside the original federal fraud indictment, The Nexacorp fraud trial proceeded with Sandra Anderson's testimony intact. Scott Hill's defense argued that her appearance at Darnell Cooper's trial demonstrated emotional investment that compromised her credibility. The jury, having reviewed 2 years of forensic audit documentation that required no emotional investment to interpret, disagreed. Scott Hill was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Gary Young remained at large. Monica kept his photograph on her board, beside Andre Williams's photograph. 2 open files, one closed, one waiting. She could live with one still waiting. She couldn't have lived with not trying. 8 months after the trial, Brandon Scott knocked on the door of Darnell's office at Beacon Med. He was 28 years old and had been promoted to head of security at the Grand Atlantic following a comprehensive review that had followed the events of November 12th. He stood in the doorway with the posture of someone who had been working up to this for longer than he wanted to admit. "Mr. Cooper," Darnell waited. "I've been trying to come here for 2 months," Brandon said. "I kept finding reasons not to." He paused. "That's not your problem. But I'm saying it because it's part of this." Darnell said nothing. Gave him the space to get where he was going. "I'm not going to tell you I was just doing my job," Brandon said. "I was doing my job. But the way I did it," he stopped, then started again. "I didn't look at you. That's what I came to say. I looked at the situation, and I made a call in about 1 second, and the call was wrong. But before the call, I'd already stopped seeing you as someone who might have something worth hearing. I'd already made a different decision." Darnell sat with that. He thought about the cold pavement, about the particular quality of being dismissed not with anger, which at least requires the other person to acknowledge your existence, but with the specific indifference of someone who has already filed you in a category that doesn't require further attention. "I know," Darnell said. "I'm sorry," Brandon said. Darnell stood up, walked to the door, put out his hand. Brandon Scott shook it. Not warmly, not coldly. 2 people acknowledging something real between them. "The Grand Atlantic changed their protocols," Brandon said. "After everything. Any report of a potential threat gets logged and evaluated regardless of the source, regardless of what the person looks like or where they're from." He paused. "The review board used your case as the training scenario." Darnell thought about that. A man on a piece of cardboard trying to tell someone something important, being turned away, turned into a training example so that the turning away would be less likely to happen the next time. That's how things changed, not all at once. Not with a single verdict or a headline or a check. One protocol updated. One training scenario revised. One person deciding to look at someone they had been looking through. 1 year after the night of the gala, Darnell parked on Michigan Avenue 15 minutes early for lunch with Monica Reed. He sat in his car, a used 2019 Civic, reliable and unremarkable. His hand looked across the street at the Grand Atlantic Hotel. The entrance where 300 cameras had recorded the worst 30 seconds of his life. And the first 30 seconds of something else that he still didn't have a complete name for. He looked at the corner where the cardboard square had been, and sorry, just concrete and shadow, and the cold of a Chicago November, making everything exactly what it was. A place where a person could become invisible if the world decided to look away, or a place where a person could see everything if they'd been given enough reason to look carefully. He sat there for a moment, then he said, quietly, to no one in particular and to someone specific, "I'm taking engineering classes again, online, Tuesday and Thursday nights. The professor says I have good spatial reasoning, which I think you would have found very funny and would not have let me forget for approximately the rest of my life. The pie is getting better. Still, not the same. It won't be the same, but I'm making it anyway." He sat there another minute, then he got out of the car. The cold came in immediately. 28 degrees, heavy and still, the same cold it had been a year ago on a piece of cardboard across the street. He pulled his coat closer and walked toward the restaurant. 1 foot in front of the other. The way you rebuild anything that actually matters, not with a single moment, however significant, but with every ordinary morning, You make the decision to show up for. Every appointment kept. Every phone call made at 4 a.m. instead of endured alone. Every pie that doesn't come out right but gets made anyway. Every cookie accepted from a neighbor. Every person you choose to see when it would be easier to look away. Every time you tell the truth when the truth costs you something. That's how it works. That is the only way it has ever worked. One day, and then another after that.